I was out of the room, so I didn't catch all of what David told you about my background, but just very briefly, I'm originally trained as a theoretical computer scientist, and in graduate school was especially interested in applying ideas from theoretical computer science and algorithms to the field that is now known as machine learning. That name didn't exist at that time. And throughout the 90s, worked in that area quite a bit, and sort of drifted a little bit more broadly into areas in artificial intelligence and related areas. And somehow around the turn of the century, I became one of the group of computer scientists who became more and more interested in algorithmic issues in game theory and more broadly in sociology and social systems. And so what I'm going to describe to you today, I think will show vestiges of all of that background in some sense, even though the work I'm going to talk about today is entirely behavioral. These are about human subject experiments that we've been running at the University of Pennsylvania over the last few years. This is a line of work that's been going on about 4 years or so now, and I've been blessed to have many great graduate students, postdocs, research scientists helping with this. It's sort of a big undertaking, as you can see. After we did the first round of experiments, I had to decide, is this a one-off lark, or is this something I want to keep doing? And I made the latter decision, and I'll let you be the judge of whether that was a good idea or not. But let me start by just spending a couple of minutes giving some broad framing. Depending on how you count, there is a field that has been emerging over the last 5 to 50 years that somewhat unfortunately has decided to name itself network science, it seems. Even if the name is unfortunate, it's a very exciting area to work in. It's a truly interdisciplinary field, by which I mean fundamental contributions are being made to this area by people from sociology, from economics, computer science, math, physics, many, many other areas as well. And not just making contributions, but there are true collaborations going on between scientists in these different areas. If I had to give sort of a very crude summary of what goes on in this field, I would divide it into its empirical component and its theoretical component. So on the empirical side, a lot of the work is driven by the measurement of very, very large-scale networks. And when I say networks here, I mean that in a very general sense. So social networks, technological networks, organizational networks, in many cases biological networks. And many of these measurements are made possible, of course, by the rampant instrumentation of society in every way. So, of course, social networks are much easier to document now that, of course, people voluntarily join them on Facebook or carry around electronic devices that track their motions and interactions in great detail. Technological networks, same thing, even in areas like biology, since I know there are a number of biologists in the room. There you have fields like connectomics, right, where great advances in the ability to measure networks, basically measure the brain at the neuronal level, are offering the opportunity to document what these networks look like, okay, for whatever purpose one is interested in. So where does network science come in? So network science is the field that I would say is sort of staked on the claim that there are a surprising number of universal structural components that appear in these networks, even though that they come from many, many domains. So the claim is that whether it's Facebook or the human brain or the network of routers in the internet, if you blur your eyes appropriately, and of course blurring your eyes is going to be required for the statement I'm about to make, there are certain structural properties that arise again and again, despite the wildly different uses and sources and origins of these networks. So this has a large literature that I'm not going to try to do justice to here, and some of you may be familiar with all of it or pieces of it. I'm certainly only familiar with pieces of it. It's a very active literature. But the typical series of claims that's made is that if you go out and measure a sort of organically or naturally growing network, i.e. one that sort of grew in a bottom-up fashion like the internet or Facebook or what have you, you'll see certain structural properties very reliably. So one of them is the so-called heavy tail degree distribution. If you take that network and you plot the histogram of how many neighbors each point in the network has, you will not see something that looks like a Poisson or normal distribution. You will see something like a Pareto or a power law distribution with a very, very long tail. And this is true of connectivity in the web, on Facebook, in many, many, many other networks. Another typical claim is that there's edge clustering, i.e. if you look at the distribution of edges or links in these networks, they'll be clumped up in little areas. They won't look like they're spread uniformly at random, okay? Another claim is the sort of apocryphal 6 degrees of separation, which more technically one would mean this small diameter, meaning that if you go look at these networks and you say measure the average shortest path distance between all pairs of individuals in the network, it'll be very, very small. Obviously, 6 is not a good definition of small, but saying something like the diameter of the network is logarithmic or even log-logarithmic in the total number of elements might be a good definition, okay? So I'm not going to try to establish this story for you now, but you can go out and read papers and books that basically tell this story and claim that these properties arise again and again. Now, the things I just mentioned are entirely topological or structural, right? They're about kind of a static snapshot of the network and its topological properties. Of course, many of the networks I just mentioned we think of as having some sort of purpose. Maybe not Facebook, but certainly the internet or the human brain or what have you. And so people, of course, are also interested in what's happening on these networks. What are the dynamical processes that are taking place? And there's a large literature on that as well. Most of it to date has been restricted to various forms of diffusion. In other words, what's happening on the network is something is spreading in a viral or contagious fashion, whether that something is an actual disease or an idea, so on and so forth. Okay? And much of the empirical work to date, and this is somewhat something that I intend to address in the work I'm going to talk about today, focuses naturally on field studies, by which I mean you go out and you meticulously measure the network by getting some appropriate data set, and then you study its structural properties and maybe dynamical processes as well. Okay, so that's sort of the empirical side of this field. On the theoretical side, the main question, or one of the main questions that arises from the empirical work is, well, if I'm claiming to you that all of these wildly different networks from wildly different domains seem to suspiciously give rise to these remarkable structural properties, and by the way, a lot of these structural properties are in tension with each other, by which I mean it's not immediately obvious why it should be common to find them in conjunction with each other. So, for example, if you take edge clustering and small diameter, for a given amount of connectivity in a network, if you want to get the diameter as small as you possibly can, the most efficient way of doing that is really to distribute it uniformly at random, the so-called Erdős-Rényi network formation model. But that won't give you edge clustering, that'll give you the opposite. So the question is, how is it that somehow this delicate balance of structural properties, many of which are in competition with each other, can arise again and again? And so a natural theoretical question that comes to mind is, are there plausible mathematical models of network formation that would give rise to the particular sets of properties that one sees in the field? And these network formation models are largely stochastic, meaning that, like the Erdős-Rényi model, for those of you that are familiar with it, the decision for who connects to whom is sort of a local stochastic process. There's randomness in it. But there's a small but growing literature on more economic or strategic models where you basically posit, well, the members of the people or individuals who are going to form the network are really players in a game, and they build the network by purchasing edges to each other at some cost, but then they get some kind of joint utility out of participating in the network that's constructed by all of their edge purchases, and then you can actually say, well, what are the equilibrium networks of this game, and then you can ask whether those networks have the structural properties that are seen in the field. Quick aside, I think that the stochastic approach so far has been much more successful at replicating the observed properties than the strategic side, but it's still early, so never say never. And again, there's quite a bit of study, of course, as many of you know, of models of diffusion or contagion in networks. The physicists in the audience will know that this topic has a literature that goes back many, many, many decades or more in terms of percolation theory and the like. Okay, so this is a broad overview of the field. And so let me just run down some of the questions that these topics give rise to. One of them I've mentioned already, which is, why do certain structural properties, or how and why do certain structural properties seem to arise repeatedly in social and other networks? What role are they playing in those networks, if any? I mean, maybe they're just an artifact of something else that's more important that we haven't discovered yet. When talking about social networks or economic networks, or really any kind of network, you can ask about what is the relative importance of influential individual behavior in those networks versus the collective behavior that emerges from individual behavior? What is the relationship between network structure and the task that's actually taking place on the network, the function of the network, if you like? And more broadly, what about, I mentioned that a lot of the study of dynamics so far has been restricted to diffusive processes of contagion. And it's quite natural to ask, well, what about behavior beyond mere diffusion? In particular, if one is thinking about social or organizational or economic networks, we often think of the behavior as not just being, sort of the blind spread of something. If we think about economic exchange in a social network, we don't think of people sort of giving their money away to their neighbors randomly. We think of them as engaging in more purposeful or strategic behavior. And so what happens beyond diffusion when you consider that kind of purposeful behavior? Okay, so as sort of a platform to investigate some of these questions, we've been running an extensive series of human subject experiments on strategic behavior in social networks at Penn over the last 4 years. I think I won't spend any time here telling you how I came to run this particular wacky set of experiments, other than to say it grew out of a large undergraduate class I teach at Penn on all of the topics on the first slide, and to illustrate the concepts to the student, I started running these sort of semi-controlled behavioral experiments, really starting in the classroom itself. And then at some point I realized, well, these seem interesting enough that maybe we should build a system which kind of automates these experiments, makes them a little bit more rigorous, and really take a more disciplined behavioral approach to these things. And that's what we've been basically doing over the last 4 years or so. So let me give you just kind of a dry rundown of what these experiments are like, because it'll set the stage for everything I want to talk about from here on. So in these experiments, we bring roughly 36 people into a lab of workstations simultaneously. And by the way, these experiments are a royal pain to organize and run in every possible sense of the word. They're a huge amount of work to design. They're a huge amount of work to build the system, to implement. Subject management and control is a huge task and problem. And then when you're done, you have this incredibly rich but incredibly detailed data set that it's just almost impossible to imagine where you should start looking for what happened, okay? But starting with the subjects come in groups of about 36 people for a sort of a series, a session consisting of many, many short experiments over several hours. They sit at workstations, which are of course connected over a local network. And in every little 1 or 2 or 3 minute experiment, each subject is going to control some simple property of a single vertex or node, namely their vertex, in some underlying network, a social network, if you like. In these experiments, subjects have only local views of the activity. Okay, so we're really doing experiments here in distributed behaviors, distributed strategic behavior in social networks. So it's distributed, meaning you only have a local view of the activity. So what you'll see that means is that in each experiment, a player at each moment will only see the state of their own vertex, which they're in control of, and those of their neighboring vertices in the network, okay? And in accordance with the hallowed principles of behavioral economics and game theory, we do not pay for mere participation in these experiments. We don't say, we'll pay you $10 an hour. We say you'll basically eat what you kill. Whatever you actually earn in the experiments, that's what you get. And by the way, this is seen as being very, very important in behavioral game theory and economics, because otherwise, the belief is if you just pay for participation, you don't really know what their motivation is, right? They might be just experimenting around. You might have concerns that they still might be doing that, but at least they would be losing money to do so here, okay? So they have a real financial incentive to solve their piece of some collective global task, okay? So there's some global problem that they need to solve in the network, but they only have local information and interactions in order to solve that problem. And as you see, they may have competing incentives, right? In some of the games, they may actually have incentives that are deliberately designed to be at odds with other people in the network. So let's take a simple example. That's the classic problem of graph coloring from the theoretical computer science and OR literature, which here we can think of, if we want to think of this as a social network, it's actually a very natural problem. It's really a problem of social differentiation. You want to be different than all of your friends, okay? So in this problem, at each moment in the experiment, all you would need to do is choose a color for your vertex from some fixed set, which by the way, you can change anytime in all of the games I'm going to talk about today. It's asynchronous update. Anybody can change the state of their vertex anytime they want to, and it'll immediately update in the system. And in the graph coloring problem, you simply want to choose a color for your vertex for some fixed set, and you're basically incentivized or paid if and only if your color is different from all of your neighbors when time expires, okay? So obviously, using language from economics here, the max welfare solutions to this problem are the proper colorings, okay? Meaning where every edge in the network has a different color on both endpoints. And by the way, when we run these experiments, we pre-compute the so-called chromatic number, the minimum number of colors needed to find a solution, and give them exactly that. We don't give them any slack, we don't give them any extra colors. Okay, so this is the kind of thing we're doing, and what we've been doing what we've been doing extensively, let me not call it systematically, over the past several years, is running a series of experiments like this, in which we're deliberately varying the network structure that we are exogenously imposing on the subjects in each little experiment, and what task we're trying to get them to solve, graph coloring or some other problem, the task of the game. And let me just comment here that one of the things that makes these experiments difficult is that even without other things being varied, which we play around with a little bit also, just these two design variables have a gargantuan search space, right? The number of possible networks over 36 individuals that we could inflict on the subjects is huge. And so, of course, is the number of possible games or tasks that we could try to impose on them as well. And so generally what we've done is chosen networks that are inspired by models from network science, this sort of generative models that I was telling you about on the last slide, everything from Erdős-Rényi truly random networks to other common generative models, some of which you may have heard of, such as small worlds or preferential attachment, sort of Watts-Strogatz types of things, so on and so forth, okay? And the tasks we've largely chosen for diversity along a couple of dimensions. One of them is whether the game is a cooperative or a competitive task, which you can broadly think of as meaning, is there a way for all of us to get the largest amount of pay simultaneously? That's what I would call a cooperative setting, versus a competitive one, which means that basically if I'm making a higher payoff, by definition, others must be making a lower payoff somewhere in the network, okay? Okay, so this is, that's sort of the background, and now I'm gonna kind of take you on a tour of these results. Just to ground things a little bit, here's a typical screenshot that you might experience as a subject in one of our experiments, and I'll use my pointer over here. Sorry for those of you on the far side over there. But in the typical GUI, you know, this is for graph coloring. There's sort of an information panel in the middle where you are clearly identified. This is your vertex in the network, and you can see your neighbors. And we're also in this particular interface, and this is quite common. We play around with this a little bit too. Here we're also showing you the edges between your neighbors. So this is what's sometimes called the first neighborhood or the ego network, because it's all about you. And you know, if you want to think about this as a social network structure, you can sort of think of this as this interface as asserting that in a social network, we would expect you to be able to articulate who your friends are. And we might even be able to expect you to know which of your friends are friends with each other. But if I ask you anything about two steps out, right, list the friends of all of your friends, you know, the general belief is that for most of us, this would be a hopeless affair, okay? So this is sort of what I view as the largest plausible amount of information one might have about the network in a real social network, okay? So you see your neighbors, and in this particular game, all you have to do is pick a color from this action panel down here. You just click on one of these buttons and it would instantly change or update your color. And anytime your neighbors change their colors, you would you know, instantly see that color update for their vertex as well, okay? And so this is all you know about the network. There might be some extremely simple or complicated structure overall, but this is the kind of picture you have in each one of the little experiments, okay? Okay, and you can see that there's the incentives are across the top. In this particular one, you get paid $2 if you're different from all of your neighbors, meaning social differentiation. Otherwise, you get nothing. Okay.
You didn't explain the numbers.
Yeah, so in some of the experiments, we also tell you how many other neighbors besides you, each of your neighbors has, so you have some sense of what their degree is. So in some of the experiments, it's not really material to the results I'm going to talk about today, but in some of the experiments, we give that additional amount of information. So that's sort of like, you know which of your friends are more and less popular overall. Okay, so mercifully you're not intended to read this slide in any detail, but this is basically just a complete list of all of the different experiments we've run over the past several years, basically organized by what the problem the subjects were trying to solve with. And that's how we also organize the experiments. We bring subjects in, they play a series of graph coloring experiments only. So they'll only be playing one game. There was one exception that I'll talk about. But you're basically playing the same game over and over again with different network structures in each one of those short experiments, right? And this is sensible because it takes a little while to train the subjects to understand one particular game. It's relatively easy for them to move from network to network and just see a new local neighborhood, but explaining a new game takes a while, so we tend to organize the sessions. Yeah, Partha.
Iterative games or single player? Single play or many play?
So each game is, say, a minute or 2 minutes long. During that game, you get to change your color as often or infrequently as you like. There's an outcome of that game, and then we move on to the next experiment, okay? But there's no identity, by the way. Everybody's anonymous. I mean, you know you're playing with the other people in the room, but there's no relationship between where you're sitting and where your neighbors in each network are. The system randomly assigns individuals to a position in the network at the start of each experiment. And so there's not the strong possibility here for reputational effects, right? You don't know that this is somebody I've interacted with before, other than as might be exposed through their actual play. Let's say they were very aggressive or very stubborn in some way. Yes.
You ever hide their stopping time?
We have not experimented with that. Okay. And by the way, not to diffuse questions like that, but when I've given this talk enough times to realize that, and I still encourage the questions because often they contain good ideas for future experiments that we sometimes follow up on. But if you ask me a question of the form, did you try X and what happened? The likely answer is no, we didn't, and I have no idea. Because one of the things I've learned from doing these experiments is that sort of slight variations of them, and this is sort of common in the social psychology experimental literature, that like if you frame the problem slightly different to subjects, you can elicit sort of wildly different behavior.
Do people play the same game many times typically, or is it just one game and then we do?
So it's the same 36 subjects sort of playing 50 little graph coloring experiments in a row, and then
different experiments, or are they?
So they're different in the sense that each network is a different network structure, and as you'll see, we might play around with other conditions such as how much things cost to do in the game. So the high level game structure is the same, and then they go through a series of experiments in which for sure the network might be changing, but other little details might be changing as well. Yes.
Sorry, so two questions, probably because I don't quite understand what the end point is. The first is do you study a distribution of final outcomes? In other words, I could imagine in many circumstances if I ran the same game 50 times with 50 different people, or even 50 times with the same people, I would get 50 different end states. And there are other games where I would always get the same end state or only a small one or two. But the way you describe it, you never seem to do the same thing more than once.
So we do, and I'm not going to give details in here, but you can go look at the source papers. We in general do try to get a certain amount of replicability. So we will fix a scenario and perhaps with that same scenario, give the exact same parameters of the experiment, say 3 times over the evening to get some repeatability. But it's a trade-off, right? In particular, you can only expect people to attend to this kind of thing for a couple of hours. It can be very tiring and cognitively demanding, and so there's a trade-off between exploration and repeatability, right? Sort of, trying lots of things. And so, as a high-level comment, when I started on this work, I really thought we were doomed to never really say anything with statistical significance for this kind of reason, right? Because the design space is so huge, you can only get a very small number of trials. I've been pleasantly surprised that, pretty much every finding we end up reporting, with a couple of exceptions, we're able to report with sort of standard significance levels. And I think that that's a testament to the effects being strong enough that you can still see them at very small samples.
Well, but therefore your interest is in essentially a relatively unique and well-defined answer rather than in a distribution itself.
Well, so I'm not sure, when you say do we study sort of a distribution of outcomes, as you'll see, we study everything, right? So, one of the highest level questions we'll ask, for instance, is did collective difficulty of sort of task difficulty, let's say as measured by how much money they made, how does that vary with network structure? Are some networks harder for the subjects in a demonstrable manner than others? Okay, so that's sort of a collective outcome, right? And so we'll ask questions like that, but we'll also go all the way down to the individual behavior as well. And for instance, define measures of stubbornness, for instance, and ask questions like, is the distribution of stubbornness across individuals, does it have significantly more variation than you would expect by chance? And if it does, is being more or less stubborn correlated or not with higher wealth? Okay, so we'll really do everything from the individual level all the way up to the collective level. Yes?
So you talked about practical difficulties in doing this in 36
Yeah.
subjects, but I mean, would you suppose that if you had the same kind of local picture, I guess it's not always exactly the same, but maybe with those 3 or 4 neighbors and a much larger set of individuals, you would still get the same kind of feeling?
It's a great question. It's one I'm, like my thing I said before, I'm not willing to I mean, so maybe I'll hold this to the end, because I mean, there's an obvious sort of future path to do these experiments on the web, and sort of do them at a much larger scale. And there's sort of nothing obviously in principle technologically preventing it. They would be very different kinds of experiments for a variety of reasons. One of them having, I mean, you're basically going to give up a lot of control. So when we do these experiments in the lab, we know exactly what everyone is doing. We know that they're attending to the task. We know that they understand the task because we've talked to them and trained them and given them a practice round. And I think if you do things on the open web, there's all kinds of other difficulties. So I believe that I'm optimistic that these results would be robust to sort of larger N, but we haven't tried it yet. Duncan Watts is starting to do such experiments with one of my former graduate students who participated in the early days of this work. But they actually have a hard time. They are not yet up to 36 running these experiments on the open web, for the reason that by the time they can get to 24, and 24 is sort of the sweet spot where if you wait longer to recruit more subjects, then you start to lose people off the back end. Okay, so actually it's hard to get 36 people to do something simultaneously on the web as well. Yeah.
Do the subjects know when the game will end, and is it possible that a good strategy might be to sort of wait till near the end and then suddenly do something? Is that...
They do, in general, they do know when they're toward the end. We try to think about chicken effects, which is what you're basically describing, and try to design the game in a way that mitigates them a little bit. I mean, there's a certain inevitability that there will be often a little flurry of activity. The games can end early, by the way, but only in the case that sort of a global solution is reached. Okay, so you can't have it stop early in a bad way for the subjects, only in a way that they're all happy with. Okay, so we worry about that, and sometimes in one experiment that I won't talk about, we actually prorated the payments throughout. We were concerned about a chicken effect at the end, so we made it more like a taxi meter. You got paid according to a one of two rates depending on your behavior continuously throughout the game. David, should I be policing questions? I mean, can we go? What's the time?
Pretty open-ended.
Okay,
This is
so
a format
okay.
where we can-
Use a chess clock.
But so I can go long too. Then here's what you're saying. I can go.
Yes.
Okay. Then I'm going to just
In the case where you have things like differential payouts, do all of the students know those rules and what the other students are getting?
They don't know what other individuals are getting, but they know the possibility of competing incentives. They basically know the high-level strategic structure of the game. So they know that in graph quality this doesn't really become an issue because everybody knows they're trying to reach the same goal ideally, right? There's a collective task. But in other ones where there's a possibility that some may make more and others may make less, they're aware of that.
Great. So
Yeah.
I just want to be sure I understand. In that example, people are instructed as to what the payoff rules are going to be. But you could imagine something in which the payoff rules were quite complicated, and instead of trying to instruct them at the beginning what they were, you sort of have a running total of how they're doing, and they
have to learn sort of what the incentives are.
You don't want to study that. You want to.
Well, I do want to study that too, but we haven't done that.
You
Yeah,
have to
no, we haven't done that. They know the rules of the game. They understand how to play.
There's no question about whether no is problematic as things get more complicated?
Whether what is more is
Well, the claim that they know because you've instructed them could be problematic if the rules
They
are
forget.
complicated enough where they forget. Or, I don't
So
know.
as you'll
I
see,
mean, there are
you know-
there are psychophysical tasks, as you know, where to try to
As you'll
instruct
see, I mean,
people,
the
it's
rules
hard.
of these games are pretty simple,
Okay.
right? The most complicated one we did was actually a network trading game where there was sort of a limit order mechanism, and that I think was the most complicated. But even that one was I think at the level that Penn undergrads could hang on. Okay, so this is just a list of all the experiments we've run to date. I'm not going to go through all these, but for each one, it sort of describes what aspect of their vertex a player is controlling, what their payoffs are, what the sort of computational difficulty of them. As a computer scientist by training, I'm sort of interested in what theoretical computer science or complexity theory has to say about the difficulty of these problems. Mind you, this is largely inapplicable to the setting I'm doing it because, complexity theory is about asymptotic problem size. Here, n is 36. It's about centralized computation. This is distributed computation from local information, but it's the only general purpose theory of algorithmic complexity that we have. And so, you can do these interesting things like pair graph coloring and consensus. So graph coloring is a problem of social differentiation. You want to be a different color than all of your neighbors. Its complement is consensus, right? Which is where you all want to be the same color. You want be the same color as all of your neighbors, and therefore have the entire network be the same color. These two problems are sort of trivial variations on each other from the viewpoint of a human subject, right? In fact, I'll describe a session in which we did half of one and half of the other, and they had no problem making the switch. Of course, these two problems couldn't be more different from the viewpoint of theoretical computer science. One of them is not just NP hard, but it's NP hard even for lousy approximations, where if nothing could be easier than consensus, just everybody picks red, right? And so I'm not going to talk about all of these. I'm going to talk just about the subset of them that all sort of share a similar form from the GUI and user's perspective, where what you're doing at every moment in the game is deciding what color you want to be at that moment. And so I'm going to describe I'm just going to sort of, and again, I gave pointers to some papers on these topics that I invite you to go read and send me feedback on. But I'm in this talk, just to keep things at a high level, I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about sort of what the actual results are and what the numerical findings are and what the p-values on the significance tests are, so on and so forth. I want to just those are all there in the paper. I just want to give you a flavor of what these experiments are like, what kinds of things happen in them, and what kinds of questions we try to ask and answer from the data in these experiments. And so I'm going to focus on experiments involving graph coloring and consensus, which I've already mentioned, and then biased voting experiments, which is sort of, it's like consensus, but where you care about what color we arrive at, and some of us may care to arrive at one color more than another color. And then I finally want to talk about very, very fresh stuff. We just did these experiments in May 2010, this year. So I still really don't know what happened in any detail in these experiments. But these, I think, are the most ambitious experiments we ran, and they address sort of the main thing. Many things bother me about the experiments we've done so far, but there's one big thing that really has bothered me about them, and we address that here, and there's one high-level finding I want to share with you that I find quite thought-provoking. Okay, so let me first talk about coloring and consensus, which we did an initial series of experiments several years ago, and then we revisited it more recently. But let me just warm up in this description by showing you some home movies of these experiments, okay? So in our very first set of coloring experiments, two of the networks that we exogenously imposed on the subjects are the networks that are shown in front of you right now. So one of them is just a simple cycle. And by the way, what you see, the colorings here are actual proper minimum colorings of the network. So a network, sort of a 3 dozen people arranged in a cycle. There's two possible colorings, right? Red, green, red, green, red, green, red, green, and then the cyclic shift of that by one position. And then this much more complicated network was generated according to the so-called preferential attachment model, which is a very well-known model which was deliberately introduced to provide kind of a naturalistic explanation of the phenomenon of a heavy-tailed degree distribution. So to build a preferential attachment network, you do it incrementally. You add new members to the network one vertex at a time, and that new vertex is going to get, say, a couple of edges
into the existing network upon their birth, right? So you arrive, you join the network, you get a couple of friends initially, and rather than those initial friends being chosen uniformly at random from the existing members of the network, they're chosen according to the current degree distribution. So if you and I are both in the network, and you have twice as many friends as I do, you're twice as likely to receive new incoming edges. So it's a rich get richer model, hence the name preferential attachment. And it's well known that this model will in fact generate a power law degree distribution, okay? And so this is a 4-colorable preferential attachment network. And so what I want to do, just for lighthearted amusement, is show you. So this is showing you an actual visualization of the sequence of play sped up by some factors so as to make it a little quicker. And so I'm just going to go ahead and start this movie. And so you see, again, people only have 2 choices of colors, and they start entering the game, as you see. And what's supposed to be visible in this diagram is that the darker edges, which are supposed to be easier to see than the gray edges, are where there's a conflict, like here. So here's 2 people who are red that are neighboring vertices. Here's another 2 who are red over here. And if you think about this, right, there's sort of a great mathematical simplicity to this problem, which is basically if there are 2 edges that are in conflict with each other and they meet each other, so first of all, a conflict has to meet another conflict in order to be resolved, and then the player in the middle can switch and change their color to cause both conflicts to disappear. So there's almost a sort of a particle on a lattice aspect to this. Of course, the subjects don't know this. They don't even know that it's a cycle. All they know is that they have 2 neighbors, and they have no idea what anybody else sees. Okay, so this was from our very first round of experiments where. The other thing that's hard in these experiments is to decide how long to give the subjects before you call that experiment a wash and go on to the next one. You have to have a time limit, unfortunately, because otherwise the first experiment might take them 3 hours. They make no money on the night. They all hate you, and you have no data, right? So, but we gradually, as we realize that people are quite good at this stuff, we gradually reduce the amount of time per experiment. But this is an example of a failed instance, a failure to find a solution to the cycle after 5 minutes of play. Okay, so this was a speed up of 5 minutes. Now, you can see that people are purposeful, right? So it's actually easier than watching the movie playing sequentially. If I take the play bar and kind of slide it back and forth, you can see local efforts to actually propagate, conflicts counterclockwise or counterclockwise. The problem is just there's no coordination, there's no bird's eye view, and nobody has any sense of clockwise or counterclockwise. So for short periods, you'll see a conflict moving, but then the one that it really needs to find is moving away from it in the other direction, and the folly just continues. Yes?
How to blame is also that you chose a cycle. It's not only also in distributed algorithms that if you try to color a cycle,
There you have it. Okay, so I proof by theory. I didn't need to run the experiment. So this is an example of what you might think of as a relatively simple topology that the subjects found quite difficult. And by the way, of all of the, I think, 6 different network structures that we threw at them in that particular initial session, this one was by far and away the hardest.
Did you see odd even differences as you would expect?
Odd even differences? What do you mean?
Yeah, because you get a domain one if you have odd number of.
So we only have an even number, right? Yeah.
But it's
So
distinguished
if
between
it's odd,
other
if it's odd, we have to give them 3 colors, right? Then it's not 2 colorable. Okay. So this, on the other hand, is this complicated-looking preferential attachment graph that they actually do quite well at. Okay. And if you stare at these movies as much as I have, you'll realize that sort of a very different dynamics takes place here and needs to take place. So this is a 4-colorable network. But because it's a preferential attachment network, you have vertices like this one here, which has many, many more neighbors than 4. This is in the low teens or maybe a dozen. So this player's experience is very likely to be that immediately at the beginning of the experiment, all 4 of the available colors are used by their neighbors. And they have no choice but to conflict with some subset of their neighbors. And so what tends to happen in these experiments is that these hub vertices tend to be relatively stable. So they'll pick a color and stick with it for a long time, hoping that the conflicts can be worked out elsewhere in the network. And then at the periphery of the network, you have sort of these, what I would call fixer vertices. This is a degree 3 vertex in a 4-colorable graph who can always resolve any conflict that arrives there. And so what tends to happen here, instead of sort of a propagation around a cycle, is you need sort of stability in the middle so that conflicts can move to the periphery of the network, to the lower degree vertices, and then be resolved there. Okay?
If the hubs make a wrong choice?
Well, there's sort of no wrong choice for the hubs, right? The most important thing is that they fix a color, and then I'm projecting here, which is a dangerous thing, right? But I mean, there's no wrong choice for them. I think the more important thing is that they play in a more stable fashion and not quickly alternate between colors, because their changes introduce a lot of conflicts, right? Whereas conflicts get resolved by the lower degree vertices.
Couldn't there be a joint wrong choice that initially the hubs stick like, they all choose green by mistake, and the question, how do they somehow transmit this and change?
I mean, I'm not sure if you're asking a theory question or a behavioral question. If you're asking a behavioral question, anything can happen.
Also in theory.
Two hubs
Yeah.
with an edge between them have to.
Yes, right. There has to be a certain amount of coordination between the hubs.
But locally, you know if you are a hub just by looking at your neighborhood?
You do not. Right, so that's the thing. You might see that you have degree 13, but for all you know, it's a 13 regular graph. Let me get back to this. Okay. Okay, so this is just a flavor of, kind of what happens in the experiments and what it's like to, if not be in them, to watch them from sort of the master console. In these experiments, we always have a GUI at sort of the back of the room with a global visualization like this. So it's quite fun to sit back there and watch what's the sort of, what I would call insect-like poignance of the struggle by 36 poor kids to work things out. This is just so let me just first talk about this network up here. And my joke about this slide is that if at some point this line of research dies, I'm thinking that I might have an alternative career as a digital postmodern artist because of the kind of Rothko-like nature of these diagrams. But let me tell you what they're showing. So we ran a series of experiments. Where the networks that were imposed on the subjects were generated from a stochastic model that I'm going to describe to you now. The sort of base case of the model is exactly the network you see here, which is, like a lot of these models or networks, it's a cartoon of a particular type of society. So this is a cartoon of sort of a highly tribal or clan-like society with loose communication between the different tribes, right? So what we have here are 36 subjects arranged into 6 cliques or completely connected subgraphs of size 6 each. So all the possible edges, there's full connectivity between these 6 individuals, these 6, so on and so forth. And then each clan has a so-called leader that's in this sort of loose chain of communication with the neighboring leaders. Of course, nobody knows any of this, right? They just see their local neighborhood. And in the generative model that we considered in this series of experiments, there was a single parameter, which is a probability, so let's call it Q. It's a number between 0 and 1. And the way you generate networks from this model is you go around to all of the internal edges here, and with probability Q, you replace, with probability 1 minus Q, you leave that edge in place, and with probability Q, you replace it with a long distance edge. So you pick one of its 2 endpoints, you remove the edge, and then you replace that edge with from the chosen endpoint to a random destination elsewhere in the network, okay? So when Q equals 0, it's exactly the network I'm showing you here. When Q is equal to 1, the network I'm showing you here is really irrelevant because we really are a random graph with the same amount of connectivity, okay? And so, like many of the models from the network science literature, this model is deliberately designed to move us between sort of 2 hypothetical cartoon extremes. One is a highly tribal society with only very weak inter-tribe communication. The other is a completely random network with lots of long-distance connectivity, small diameter, so on and so forth, okay? And so if you choose a value of Q in between, you get something in between. So just very quickly describing what these pictures are, and I'll let you just stare at them for a minute. They're kind of fascinating and amusing in some ways. Each one of these diagrams is showing you an actual visualization of play in one of the experiments in which the value of Q was either 0 or a small value. Maybe 0, maybe 10% replacement rate or 20% replacement rate, okay? So we're still quite close to this original structure. Maybe there's been some modification and some long distance connectivity, but this structure is largely in place. And so in each one of these visualizations, the time in the experiment is across the x-axis, and for each player there is a row, showing what that player was playing at that particular instant in the experiment. And because of the structure here, I've of course chosen that the first 6 rows correspond to this clique, the next 6 rows correspond to this clique, the next 6 rows correspond to this clique. So you see a certain amount of consistency in these experiments. At the beginning, by the way, in the consensus experiment, there's no obvious number of colors to choose, unlike the coloring experiments. And in general, more is harder, right? Because unlike coloring, right? The more colors you have, the color choices you have in graph coloring, the easier it gets. In consensus, since you're trying to coordinate, the more choices, the harder. By the way, as a sort of experimental aside, one of the greatest fears I have in these experiments is not realizing something about the design of the experiment until the night of the experiment and then having the entire evening trivialized by it. And about 1 week before we ran these experiments, my colleague Stephen Judd came to me and said, what if in the first experiment, by chance, they happen to reach global consensus to red? What do you think they're going to do in the second experiment? And I kind of hit my head and I realized, oh, this is bad. So the way we get around this, by the way, is that although everybody sees colors in their local interface, the true colors are the integers 1 through 9. And everybody has a private random permutation from their visible colors to the integers 1 through 9, which actually determine the solution. So what looks green, even though there's local consistency for everybody, what looks green to me might be red to you in this experiment, and what looks red to me in this experiment might look like brown to you in the next experiment. So it's impossible to establish social conventions. In particular, even if a subject stands up and yells out against the protocol, of course, everybody choose red, it won't work for this reason, okay?
Are the initial conditions random or blank?
The initial conditions are blank, so everybody has to actively enter the game by choosing one of the 9 colors. And so what you see here is that, in the first few milliseconds, there's a great diversity. Sort of all 9 of the colors are used. And then very, very quickly, it narrows down to a small number of colors. You see groups tend to change in blocks, right, corresponding to their clique. Somebody in that clique changes to light blue, and eventually everybody in that clique changes to light blue. But eventually they realize that elsewhere there are people choosing another color, and so you can see that pretty quickly in all these experiments, this one in particular, you get down to 2 or 3 colors fairly quickly, and then there's sort of a network battle over what color is going to be chosen, right? And a lot of people may see only one color in their neighborhood, and it's only these connectors to neighboring tribes that have any information that we're not in a global solution yet, okay? Of the 18 experiments we ran of this kind, at sort of small values of p, all of them completed in the allotted time except for one. This is the image of the one that failed. And it's quite rich, right? You can see that pretty quickly they were down to 3 colors. About midway through the experiment, they were almost at consensus except for this one holdout clique. Shortly after that, this clique gives it up and switches over to the blue, but not just before their behavior sort of weakly propagates across the network and then takes a firm foothold on the other side until a little bit later, we're sort of at the opposite situation and almost have consensus to this color, and at the end it's still not over. You can also...
The others are all a single color in the last...
Huh?
The others are all a single color in the last...
So all these other ones end exactly where, for instance, this guy changed to this color and then the experiment halted.
And P is Q?
Yes, I'm sorry, P is Q. Sorry about that. But P will be back to Q on the next slide, I think. You can also see fascinating acts of individual behavior as well, including sort of irrational stubbornness. So here's somebody who's playing this color for almost the entire length of the experiment with virtually nobody in the network playing that color. You see acts of signaling, right? These are probably people who can see that there's another color elsewhere in the neighborhood and are either trying to experiment or tell their neighbors that there's something else going on in the network and trying to get them to switch, so on and so forth. Okay, so everything I've told you so far is kind of an anecdote. And I'm mainly going to tell you anecdotes today. Again, I invite you to go read the papers for the science, such as it is. But let me tell you, the type of hypothesis that we might try to test and what one can say about such hypotheses in a more controlled fashion. And so this is actually referring to the experiments I just described, where the generative model was this chain of cliques with this rewiring parameter now properly called Q. And so I'm going to describe this plot to you. So, the x-axis is q, so over here at q equals 0, the network is simply deterministically that chain of cliques. Over at q equals 1, it's random networks. We chose for the experiments a bunch of different values of q and sampled several networks from the model at that value of q to get some repeatability, okay? And so what am I showing you? So on the set of networks that we generated, we ran coloring experiments and consensus experiments on every single network. So for every single network, there was both a consensus experiment and a coloring experiment, okay? And what I'm showing you here is the average time to reach a global solution as a function of this parameter q, okay? And so what's this diagram is making a very simple point, which I've not seen made in the network literature, network science literature so far, which was sort of part of the point of the design of the experiments, which is that these problems are being run on the same networks. We have a parameter which is controlling some structural property of the underlying networks. And we have two different problems that we're giving to the subjects that from a cognitive standpoint are extremely similar. One's a problem of social coordination or agreement, the other's a problem of social differentiation. You can see, and so please just focus on the dark lines here, the non-dashed ones. You can see that the difficulty of consensus becomes radically lower. The problem gets much easier as you replace local tribal connectivity with long-distance connectivity. And the difficulty of coloring gets significantly harder as you replace local connectivity by long-distance coloring. So what's the point I'm trying to make here? The point I'm trying to make here is a simple one, which is that it doesn't really make sense to talk about network structure independent of the actual process that's the dynamics taking place on the network. So what's sort of good or helpful structure for one kind of task can actually have the opposite effect for not just a different task, but a task that I think from a cognitive standpoint is very, very similar. And in many ways, this diagram is somewhat of a reaction to the very large literature that talks about social network structure in isolation of any actual task being solved. So you have all this, you have these hubs or connectors, you have small diameter, you have clustering of edges, and and so that's very interesting up to a point, but at some point one should be motivated to ask, well, why does this matter? What is this good for? Is there is there something about the tasks that interacts with that structure in a positive way, or in fact are some of these structural properties damaging? And this slide is making perhaps the point that you would have guessed ahead of time, which is that it depends on what they're doing, but sort of in a very, very clean way. Yeah.
Does that have anything to do with people? If you had an algorithm
okay.
that was supposed to work across all the different networks,
good.
It would probably.
So the dashed lines are showing our best efforts to fit a very simple parametric model to sort of replicate the same effect. So you can come up with simple models for behavior that will in fact give you this effect, although you're not actually getting the crossing of the diagram here. But I think that's less important than just the fact that the two problems are behaving oppositely with respect to this structural parameter. And by the way, I won't talk about it a lot, but in all of our experiments, we will, after the fact, sort of try to think of simple behavioral models that would explain, not perfectly the collective outcome, but sort of the macroscopic high-level outcome. Yeah.
Reminds me of quite a to the network science, whatever that may be, but it's physics, I guess. It's a Potts models, anti-ferromagnetic or ferromagnetic Potts models that you're dealing with. And I guess Pierre would say that you're looking at the fact that Hamiltonians living on different dimensions or different graph topologies. There's an interaction in the dimensionality of the connectivity graph and the Hamiltonian that lives on it. And that's maybe a richer and older literature to connect to it.
Yeah. So I'm interested in all these things, although I should emphasize, right, I'm interested in the task or the idea of sort of trying to replicate the behavior with simple theoretical models. But my primary interest here is actually in the behavior, right? So and so I think it's interesting, for instance, if human behavior can be explained by models from statistical physics, for instance. But first you have to go measure the behavior before you can talk about whether that's true or not. And by the way, it's quite interesting, right? We give extensive exit surveys to our subjects in which we asked them a number of questions, including just asking them to freely pontificate about their own strategies or play and others as well. And for instance, in the initial graph coloring experiments, basically a number of them described in their own language the injection of thermal noise to escape from local suboptimal equilibrium. They would basically say, when I sensed there wasn't much activity around me, yet we didn't seem to have reached a global solution yet, I would just try to randomly, change my color to shake things up. So you actually have, human subjects recreating simulated annealing from scratch, and why not?
Who are your subjects? Students?
They're Penn students, yeah.
They're not the average subject on the internet.
They still don't know about simulated annealing. Yeah.
Aren't there more colorings for LoQ? I mean, there's more than one minimal coloring on a given graph. Isn't there generally more colorings for LoQ?
Right. So again, I'm not saying there aren't sort of structural reasons. I'm not saying you can't come up with explanations for this, but that's different from sort of showing behaviorally that on a group of human subjects that these kinds of things matter, right? And by the way, it's not at all clear that the number of solutions should have any clear relationship to difficulty, right? Like, the cycle has only 2 possible colorings out of an exponentially large number of non-solution configurations, but I don't think most of us would think of that as a difficult problem. Yes?
Yeah, maybe you said it, I didn't catch it. How long does the game go on?
These ones we play around with this depending on how much we want to try to get done. These ones were 2 minutes apiece in this particular set of experiments that this diagram is from. Yeah?
Did you end up with any subjects who admitted to intentional outlier behavior? Were you interested in?
We're always interested in that, especially in experiments where a single player
stayed on one color.
Yeah, so we actually worry about that in cases where the incentives are such that a single player could ruin the entire evening via irrational play. Meaning just deliberately trying to make sure that nobody gets any payoff throughout the entire night. I mean, this is a possibility. Not only do we not have people admit to that, but it's never actually happened.
Might be interesting.
It might happen.
The robustness of the network.
Yeah. And by the way, it's not entirely clear that it's irrational. So if I'm holding out for my higher payoff, right? If I'm holding out for my higher payoff and I can sort of establish that, even without identity, I can establish that I'm out there and that there's somebody who ruined all of our payoffs in an experiment. Just think about your question when we come to the next set of experiments, in which this sort of spoiler behavior is a distinct possibility, even though luckily it did not occur.